The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 4, Side 1. The assaults of the Central European tribes against the frontier had stopped only for a breathing spell. In this struggle to destroy an empire and make barbarism free, peace was but an armistice. In 169, the Chatti invaded the Roman regions of the Upper Rhine. In 170, the Chauci attacked Belgica, and another force besieged Sarmizegetusa. The Kostoboii crossed the Balkans into Greece and plundered the Temple of the Mysteries at Eleusis, 14 miles from Athens. The Morai, or Moors, invaded Spain from Africa, and a new tribe, the Longobardi, or Lombards, made its first appearance on the Rhine. Despite 100 defeats, the fertile barbarians were growing stronger, the barren Romans weaker. Marcus saw that it was now a war to the death, that one side must destroy the other or go under. Only a man schooled in the Roman and Stoic sense of duty could have transformed himself so completely from a mystic philosopher into a competent and successful general. The philosopher remained hidden under the imperator's armor. In the very tumult of this second Marcomannic War, from 169 to 175, in his camp facing the Quadi on the river Grana, Marcus wrote that little book of meditations by which the world chiefly remembers him. This glimpse of a frail and fallible saint, pondering the problems of morality and destiny while leading a great army in a conflict on which the fate of the empire turned, is one of the most intimate pictures that time has preserved of its great men. Pursuing the Sarmatians by day, he could write with sympathy of them at night. A spider, when it has caught a fly, thinks it has done a great deed. So does one who has run down a hare, or who has captured Sarmatians. Are they not all alike robbers? Nevertheless, he fought the Sarmatians, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Yazyges, through 6 hard years, defeated them, and marched his legions as far north as Bohemia. It was apparently his plan to use the Hercynian and Carpathian ranges as a new frontier. If he had succeeded, Roman civilization might have made Germany, like Gaul, Latin in speech and classical in heritage. But at the height of his successes, he was shocked to learn that Avidius Cassius, after putting down a revolt in Egypt, had declared himself emperor. Marcus surprised the barbarians with a hasty peace, merely annexing a 10-mile strip on the north bank of the Danube and leaving strong garrisons on the southern side. He summoned his soldiers, told them that he would gladly yield his place to Avidius if Rome wished it, promised to pardon the rebel, and marched into Asia to encounter him. Meanwhile, a centurion killed Cassius, and the rebellion collapsed. Marcus passed through Asia Minor and Syria to Alexandria, mourning like Caesar that he had been cheated of a chance for clemency. At Smyrna, Alexandria, and Athens, he walked the streets without a guard, wore the mantle of a philosopher, attended the lectures of the leading teachers, and joined with them in discussion, speaking Greek. During his stay at Athens, he endowed professorships in each of the great schools of doctrine, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean. In the fall of 176, after almost 7 years of war, Aurelius reached Rome and was accorded a triumph as the savior of the empire. The emperor associated Commodus with himself in the victory, and now made him, a lad of 15, his colleague on the throne. For the first time in nearly a century, the principle of adoption was put aside, and the hereditary principate was resumed. Marcus knew what perils he was inviting for the empire. He chose them as a lesser evil than the civil war that Commodus and his friends would wage if he were denied the throne. We must not judge him with hindsight. Neither did Rome anticipate the consequences of this love. There the plague had burned itself out, and men were beginning to be happy again. The capital had suffered little from the wars, which had been financed with remarkable economy and little extra taxation. While battle raged on the frontiers, trade flourished within, and money jingled everywhere. It was the height of Rome's tide and of its emperor's popularity. All the world acclaimed him as at once a soldier, a sage, and a saint. But his triumph did not deceive him. He knew that the problem of Germany had not been solved. Convinced that further invasions could be prevented only by an active policy of extending the frontier to the mountains of Bohemia, he set forth with Commodus in 178 on the Third Marcomannic War. Crossing the Danube, he again defeated the Quadi after a long and arduous campaign. No resistance remained, and he was about to annex the lands of the Quadi, the Marcomanni, and the Sarmatians, roughly Bohemia and Danubian Galicia, as new provinces, when sickness struck him down in his camp at Vindobona, now Vienna. Feeling death's hand, He called Commodus to his side and warned him to carry through the policy which was now so near fulfillment, and realize the dream of Augustus by pushing the boundary of the empire to the Elbe. Then he refused all further food or drink. On the 6th day he rose with his last strength and presented Commodus to the army as the new emperor. Returning to his couch, he covered his head with the sheet and soon afterward died. When his body reached Rome, the people had already begun to worship him as a god who for a while had consented to live on the earth. Chapter 20. Life and Thought in the 2nd Century, AD 96 to 192. 1. Tacitus. The policies of Nerva and Trajan liberated the suppressed mind of Rome and gave to the literature of their reigns a note of fierce resentment against a despotism that had gone but might come again. Pliny's panegyric voiced it in welcoming the first of 3 great Spaniards to the throne. Juvenal seldom sang any other note, and Tacitus, the most brilliant of historians, became a delator temporis acti, an accuser of times past, and excoriated a century with his pen. We do not know the date or place of Tacitus's birth, nor even his given name. Probably he was the son of Cornelius Tacitus, procurator of imperial revenue in Belgic Gaul. Through this man's advancement, the family was raised from the equestrian class into the new aristocracy. Our first definite fact about the historian is his own statement. Agricola, during his consulship in 78, agreed to a marriage between myself and his daughter, who might certainly have looked for a prouder connection. He had received the usual education, and had learned to the full those oratorical arts which enliven his style, that skill in prose and cons which marks the speeches in his histories. The younger Pliny often heard him in the courts, admired his stately eloquence, and acclaimed him as the greatest orator in Rome. In 88, Tacitus was praetor. Thereafter he sat in the Senate and confesses with shame that he failed to speak out against tyranny, and joined in the senatorial condemnation of Domitian's senatorial victims. Nerva made him consul in 97, and Trajan appointed him proconsul of Asia. He was evidently a man of affairs and practical experience. His books were the afterthought of a full life, the product of a leisurely old age and of a mature and profound mind. One theme unites them: hatred of autocracy. His Dialogue on Orators, if it is his, attributes the decline of eloquence to the suppression of liberty. His Agricola, the most perfect of those brief monographs to which the ancients confined biography, proudly recounts the achievements of his father-in-law as general and governor, and then bitterly records Domitian's dismissal and neglect of him. The little essay on the situation and origin of the Germans contrasts the virile virtues of a free people with the degeneration and cowardice of Romans under the despots. When Tacitus praises the Germans for considering infanticide an infamy and giving no advantage to childlessness, he is not describing Germans but denouncing Romans. The philosophical purpose destroys the objectivity of the study, but allows a remarkable breadth of view in a Roman official praising the German power of resisting Rome. The success of these essays induced Tacitus to illustrate the evils of tyranny by indicting the record of the despots in ruthless detail. He began with what was freshest in his memory and in the testimony of his older friends, the period from Galba to the death of Domitian. And when these historiae were acclaimed by a grateful aristocracy as the best historical writing since Livy, he continued his story à front by describing, in the Annales, the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Of the 14, some say 30, books of the histories, 4.5 remain, all devoted to the years 69 and 70. Of the Annals, 12 books survive from an original 16 or 18. Even in this mutilated form, they are the most powerful works in extant Roman prose. We may vaguely imagine the grandeur and impress of the whole. Tacitus had hoped to chronicle also the reigns of Augustus, Nerva, and Trajan, mitigating the gloom of his published works with some commemoration of constructive statesmanship. But the years were not given him, and posterity has judged him as he judged the past, from a somber aspect alone. The chief duty of the historian, he thought, is to judge the actions of men, so that the good may meet with the reward due to virtue, and pernicious citizens may be deterred by the condemnation that awaits evil deeds at the tribunal of posterity. It is a strange conception which turns history into a last judgment, and the historian into God. So conceived, history is a sermon, ethics teaching by horrible examples, and falls, as Tacitus assumed, under the rubric of rhetoric. It is easy for indignation to be eloquent, but hard for it to be fair. No moralist should write history. Tacitus remembered tyranny too intimately to view tyrants calmly. He saw nothing in Augustus but the destruction of freedom and supposed that all Roman genius had ended with Actium. He seems never to have thought of tempering his indictments by recording the excellent administration and growing prosperity of the provinces under the imperial monsters. No one would suspect from reading him that Rome was an empire as well as a city. Perhaps the lost books viewed the provincial world. Those that remain make Tacitus a deceptive guide who never lies but never reveals the truth. He often cites and sometimes critically examines his sources, histories, speeches, letters, acta diurna, acta senatus, and the traditions of old families. But for the most part he has heard only the stories of the persecuted nobility, and never imagines that the executions of senators and the assassinations of emperors were incidents in a long contest between vicious, cruel, and competent monarchs and a decadent, cruel, and incompetent aristocracy. He is fascinated by striking personalities and events rather than by forces, causes, ideas, and processes. He draws the most brilliant and unjust character portraits in history, but he has no conception of economic influences upon political events, no interest in the life and industry of the people, the stream of trade, the conditions of science, the status of woman, the vicissitudes of belief, the achievements of poetry, philosophy, or art. In Tacitus, Seneca, Lucan, and Petronius die, but they do not write. The emperors kill, but they do not build. Perhaps the great historian was limited by his audience. Probably he read parts of his work, following the custom of the time, to the aristocratic friends whom Pliny describes as crowding to his receptions. He would have told us that these men and women knew Roman life, industry, literature, and art, and did not have to be reminded of them. What they wanted to hear again and again was the exciting story of the evil emperors, the heroic deeds of Stoic senators, the long war of their noble class against tyrannical power. We cannot condemn Tacitus for not succeeding in what he did not attempt. We can only regret the narrowness of his great purpose and the limitations of his powerful mind. He does not pretend to be a philosopher. He praises Agricola's mother for dissuading her son, who had acquired a keener zest for philosophy than became a Roman and a senator. His imagination and art, like Shakespeare's, were too creatively active to let him ponder quietly the meaning and possibilities of life. He is as rich in illuminating comment as in unverified scandal, but it is difficult to find in him any consistent view of God or man or the state. He is cautiously ambiguous on matters of faith and suggests that it is wiser to accept one's native religion than to try to replace it with knowledge. He rejects most astrologers, auguries, portents, and miracles, but accepts some. He is too much of a gentleman to deny the possibility of what so many have affirmed. In general, events seem to prove the indifference of the gods to good and bad alike, and the existence of some unknown, perhaps capricious force that drives men and states fatally onward to their destiny, urgentibus imperii fatis. He hopes that Agricola has departed to a happy life, but he obviously doubts it and contents himself with the last illusion of great minds, an immortality of fame. Nor does any utopian aspiration console him. Most plans of reformation are at first embraced with ardor, but soon the novelty ceases and the scheme ends in nothing. Matters are temporarily better in his time, he reluctantly admits, but not even the genius of Trajan will prevent renewed deterioration. Rome is rotten, literally to the core, in the hearts of men, of a populace whose disorder of soul has made an anarchy of freedom, a rabble fond of innovation and change and ever ready to shift to the side of the strongest. He mourns the malignity of the human mind, and scorns like Juvenal the alien stocks in Rome. After blackening the empire, he does not dream of returning to the Republic, but hopes that the adoptive emperors will reconcile the Principate with liberty. In the end, he thinks character is more important than government. What makes a people great is not its laws, but its men. If, despite our surprise in finding a sermon and a drama where we had looked for history, we must nevertheless rank Tacitus among the greatest of historians, it is because the power of his art redeems the limitations of his view. Above all, he sees intensely, sometimes deeply, always vividly. The portraits he draws stand out more clearly, stride the stage more livingly than any others in historical literature. Here, too, however, there are blemishes. Tacitus composes speeches for his varied personages, all in his own fashion and majestic prose. He describes Galba as a simpleton and makes him talk like a sage. And he does not rise to the difficult art of making his characters develop in time. Tiberius is the same at the beginning of his reign as at the end. and if he appeared to be human at the outset, it was, Tacitus thinks, pure dissimulation. First and last in Tacitus is the splendor of his style. No other author has ever said so much so compactly. This does not mean that he is brief. On the contrary, he is desultory and diffuse and takes 400 pages of the histories to chronicle 2 years of time. Sometimes the condensation is extreme to the point of affectation or obscurity. Every second word then requires a sentence to translate it. Verbs and conjunctions are disdained as crutches for crippled minds. This is the culmination of Sallust's concise rapidity, of Seneca's pithy epigrams, of the balanced clauses taught in the schools of rhetoric. In a long work, such a style, unrelieved with passages of a more even tenor, becomes an exhausting excitement to the reader, who nevertheless returns to it with mounting fascination. This martial brusqueness, more economical of words than of men, this scorn of the props of syntax, this passion of feeling and clearness of visualization, this tang of a novel vocabulary and murderous pungency of unhackneyed phrase, give to the writing of Tacitus a swiftness, color, and force which no ancient author has equaled. The color is dark, the mood is gloomy, the sarcasm stings, and the tone of the whole is that of a Dante without tenderness. But the cumulative effect is overwhelming. Along this black river of relentless exposure we are carried, despite our reservations and objections, by a narrative at once dignified and turbulent, stately and impetuous. Character after character rises upon the stage and is struck down. Scene after scene rushes on until all Rome seems ruined and all the participants are dead. We can hardly believe when we emerge from this chamber of horrors that this period of despotism, cowardice, and immorality flowed into the zenith of monarchy under Hadrian and the Antonines, and the quiet decency of Pliny's friends. Tacitus was wrong in scorning philosophy, that is, perspective. All his faults were due to lack of it. If he could have disciplined his pen to the service of an open mind, he would have placed his name first on the list of those who have labored to give form and permanence to the memory and heritage of mankind. 2. Juvenal. Unfortunately, Juvenal corroborates Tacitus. What the one writes in mordant prose about princes and senators, the other chants in bitter verse about women and men. Decimus Junius Juvenalis, son of a rich freedman, was born at Aquinum in Latium in 59. He came to Rome for his education and practiced law there for his own amusement. His satires betray the shock of rural tastes struck by the loose turmoil of city life. Yet he appears to have been friends with Martial, whose epigrams show no prejudice in favor of morality. Shortly before Domitian's death, says an uncertain tradition, Juvenal composed and circulated among his friends a satire on the influence of dancers at court. The pantomime actor Paris, we are told, took offense and had him exiled to Egypt. We cannot say if the story is true, nor when Juvenal returned. In any case, he published nothing till after Domitian's death. The first volume of his 16 satires appeared in 101, the remainder in 4 volumes at intervals in a long life. Probably they were unforgiving memories of Domitian's time, but the indignation that makes them so vivid and unreliable suggests that a few years of the good emperors had not cured the evils he denounced. Perhaps again he chose the satire as a characteristic Roman form, found models and some material in Lucilius, Horace, and Persius, and molded his fulminations and his wrath on the rhetorical principles that he had learned in the schools. We shall never know how darkly our picture of imperial Rome has been colored by the pleasures of denunciation. Juvenal takes everything for his subject, and has no trouble in finding in everything some aspect that can bear condemning. We are arrived at the zenith of vice, he thinks, and posterity will never be able to surpass us. So far, so true. The root of the evil is the unscrupulous pursuit of wealth. He scorns the plebs that once ruled armies and unmade kings, but can now be bought with panem et circenses, bread and circuses. This is one of 100 phrases to which Juvenal's vitality gave lasting life. He resents the influx of Oriental faces, dress, ways, smells, and gods, protests against the clannishness of the Jew, and likes least of all the greedy little Greek, Graeculus Esurriens, the degenerate descendant of a people once great but never honest. He loathes the informers who, like Pliny's Regulus, get rich by reporting unpatriotic remarks, the legacy hunters who flutter around childless old men, the proconsul living in lifelong luxury on the profits of a term in the provinces, the clever lawyers who spin out lawsuits like an excreted web. He is disgusted above all by sexual excesses and perversions, by the roue who on marrying finds that his lechery has left him impotent, by the dandies whose manners, perfumes, and desires make them indistinguishable from women, and by the women who think that emancipation means that they should be indistinguishable from men. His sixth and bitterest satire is devoted to the gentler sex. Posthumus is thinking of marriage. Don't do it, Juvenal warns him. And then the poet portrays the women of Rome as selfish, shrewish, superstitious, extravagant, quarrelsome, haughty, vain, litigious, adulterous, equaling every marriage with a divorce, substituting lapdogs for children, going in for athletics, worse yet, for literature, quoting Virgil at you, spouting rhetoric and philosophy. Oh, may the gods save us from a learned wife. He concludes that there is hardly a woman in the city worth marrying. A good wife is a rare bird, or rara avis, stranger than a white crow. He marvels that Posthumus should think of marriage when there are so many halters to be had, so many high and dizzy windows are accessible, and the Emilian Bridge is close at hand. No, stay single, and get out of this nerve-wearying bedlam called Rome and live in some quiet Italian town where you will meet honest men and be safe from criminals, poets, collapsing tenements, and Greeks. Put ambition behind you. The goal is not worth the striving, so long is labor, and so brief is fame. Live simply, cultivate your garden, desire only so much as hunger and thirst, cold and heat demand. Learn pity, be kind to children, keep a sane mind in a healthy body. Mens sana in corpore sano. But only a fool will pray for a long life. We can understand such a mood. It is pleasant to contemplate the imperfections of our neighbors and the despicable inferiority of the world as compared with our dreams. Our enjoyment in this case is sharpened by Juvenal's street-corner vocabulary, his easy-moving colloquial hexameters, his grim humor, and his lusty style. But we must not take him literally. He was angry. He had not made his way in Rome as rapidly as he had hoped. It was sweet revenge to lay about him with the bludgeon of a hatred that never feigned to be fair. His moral standard was high and sound, though tinged with conservative prejudices and delusions about the virtuous past. By these standards, used without mercy or modesty, we could indict any generation anywhere. Seneca knew how old a pastime this is. Our forefathers, he wrote, complained, we complain, and our descendants will complain that morals are corrupt, that wickedness holds sway, that men are sinking deeper and deeper into sinfulness, that the condition of mankind is going from bad to worse. Around the immoral hub of any society is a spreading wheel of wholesome life, in which the threads of tradition, the moral imperatives of religion, the economic compulsions of the family, the instinctive love and care of children, the watchfulness of women and policemen, suffice to keep us publicly decent and moderately sane. Juvenal is the greatest of Roman satirists, as Tacitus is the greatest of Roman historians, but we should err as much in taking their picture as accurate as we should were we to accept without scrutiny the pleasant and civilized scene that rises before us as we read the letters of Pliny. 3. A Roman gentleman. When he was born at Como in 61, he was named Publius Caecilius Secundus. His father owned a farm and villa near the lake and held high office in the town. Orphaned early, Publius was adopted and educated first by Virginius Rufus, governor of Upper Germany, and then by his uncle, Caius Plinius Secundus, author of the Natural History. This busy scholar made the boy his son and heir and died soon afterward. According to custom, the youth took his adoptive father's name, causing confusion for 2,000 years. At Rome, he studied under Quintilian, who formed his taste on Cicero and must receive some of the credit for the Ciceronian fluency of Pliny's style. At 18, he was admitted to the bar. At 39, he was chosen to deliver an address of welcome to Trajan. In the same year, he was made consul. In 103, augur. In 105, curator of the bed and banks of the Tiber and the city sewers. He took no fees or gifts for his legal services, but he was a rich man and could afford to be magnanimous. He had properties in Etruria, at Beneventum, Como, and Laurentum, and offered 3 million sesterces for another. Like many aristocrats of his time, he amused himself by writing, at first a Greek tragedy, then some poems, light-hearted and occasionally obscene. Reproved by some, he confessed his fault impenitently and proposed again to indulge in mirth, wit, and gaiety, and enter into the spirit of the most wanton muse. Hearing his letters praised, he composed some for publication and issued them at intervals from 97 to 109. Intended not only for the public but for the pleasure of the circles he described, they avoided the darker aspects of Roman life and passed by as too serious for his purpose the larger problems of philosophy and statesmanship. Their worth is in their graceful intimacy, and in the rosy light they shed upon Roman character and patrician ways. Pliny reveals himself with half the candor and all the felicity of Montaigne. He has an author's inevitable vanity, but so openly that it hardly offends. Nothing, I confess, so strongly affects me as the desire of a lasting name. He speaks appreciatively of others as well as of himself, adding that one may be sure a man has many virtues if he admires those of others. In any case, it is a relief, coming from Juvenal and Tacitus, to hear an author speak well of his fellow men. He was as generous in act as in words, ever ready with favors, loans, or gifts, from finding a husband for a friend's niece to enriching his native town. Finding that Quintilian could not give his daughter a dowry befitting the high station of the man she was marrying, he sent her 50,000 sesterces, excusing the smallness of the gift. He gave an old schoolmate 300,000 to make him eligible for the equestrian class. When the daughter of a friend inherited a legacy of debts, he paid them off, and at some risk he lent a considerable sum to a philosopher banished by Domitian. To Como he gave a temple, a secondary school, an institute for poor children, a municipal bath, and 11 million sesterces for a public library. What is especially pleasing in him is his love for his home, or his homes. He does not denounce Rome, but he is happier in Como or Laurentum, near the lake or the sea. There his chief enterprises are reading and doing nothing. He loves his gardens and the mountain scenery behind them. He did not have to wait for Rousseau to make him enjoy nature. He speaks with the greatest tenderness of his third wife, Calpurnia, her sweet temper and pure mind, her fond delight in his success and his books. She read them all, he believed, and learned many of his pages by heart. She set his poems to music and sang them, and had a private corps of couriers to keep her informed of every development when he was trying an important case. She was but one of many good women in his circle. He tells of the modesty, patience, and courage of a 14-year-old girl who, just betrothed, learned that she had an incurable illness and cheerfully awaited death. Of Pompeius Saturninus's wife, whose letters to her husband were lyrics of affection and fine Latin. Of Thraseia's daughter Fannia, who uncomplainingly bore exile for defending her husband Helvidius, nursed a relative through a dangerous illness, caught it, and died of it. How complete, he exclaims, is her virtue, her sanctity, her sobriety, her courage. He had 100 friends, some great, many good. He joined with Tacitus in prosecuting Marius Priscus for dishonesty and cruelty as proconsul in Africa. The two orators corrected each other's speeches and invested in mutual compliments. Tacitus lifted Pliny to heaven by reporting that the literary world was pairing them as the leading writers of the age. He knew Martial, but from an aristocratic distance. He took Suetonius with him to Bithynia and helped him to get the right of 3 children without having any. His circle buzzed with literary and musical amateurs, with public recitals of poetry and speeches. I do not believe, says the learned Boissier, that in any other period has literature been so greatly loved. Homer and Virgil were being studied on the banks of the Danube and the Rhine, and the Thames was trembling with rhetoric. It was, in its upper half, an elegant and amiable society, rich in loving marriages, parental affection, humane masters, sincere friendships, and fine courtesies. I accept your invitation to supper, reads one letter, but I must make this agreement beforehand, that you dismiss me soon and treat me frugally. Let our table abound only in philosophical conversation, and let us enjoy even that within limits. Most of the men whom Pliny describes were members of the new aristocracy stemming from the provinces. They were not idlers, for nearly every one of them held public office and shared in the admirable administration of the empire under Trajan. Pliny himself was sent as propraetor to Bithynia to restore the solvency of some cities there. His letters include some inquiries addressed to the prince and Trajan's pithy replies. They show Pliny accomplishing his mission with ability and honor, though with a strangely detailed dependence upon the emperor's advice. His final letter begs forgiveness for sending his sick wife home by the coaches of the imperial post. Thereafter, Pliny disappears from literature and history, leaving behind him a redeeming picture of a Roman gentleman and of Italy in her happiest age. 4. The cultural decline. We should obscure these outstanding figures if we were to surround them with lesser lights. After them there were no giants in pagan Latin letters. Reason had made its great effort from Ennius to Tacitus, and had spent itself. It is a shock to pass from the grandeur of the histories and the annals to the scandalous chronicle of Suetonius's Lives of Illustrious Men in 110. History is here degenerating into biography, and biography into anecdote. Portents and miracles and superstitions crowd the pages, and only the Elizabethan English of Philemon Holland's translation of 1606 has raised the book to the level of literature. Less disturbing is the descent from Pliny to the letters of Fronto. Perhaps these were not meant for publication and cannot be fairly compared with Pliny's. Some were spoiled by a search for archaic phraseology, but many are touched by real affection of the teacher for his pupil. Aulus Gellius supported the archaizing movement in his Attic Nights of 169, the largest collection of worthless trifles in ancient literature, and Apuleius brought it to a climax in The Golden Ass. Apuleius and Fronto came from Africa, and the fad may have had partial source in the fact that written Latin there had departed less than in Rome from the language of the people and the Republic. Fronto rightly believed in strengthening literature with popular speech, as one freshens a plant by turning over the earth at its roots. But youth does not come twice to a man, a nation, a literature, or a language. Orientalization had set in and could not be stopped. The common Greek tongue of the Hellenistic East and Oriental Rome was becoming the language of literature as well as of life. Fronto's pupil chose it for his meditations. Appian, an Alexandrian Greek living at Rome, chose Greek for his vivid histories of Rome's wars, circa 160. So did Claudius Aelian, a Roman by birth and blood. A half-century later, Dio Cassius, a Roman senator, would write his history of Rome in Greek. Leadership in literature was passing back from Rome to the Greek East, not to the Greek spirit, but to the Oriental soul using Hellenic speech. There would be giants again in Latin, but they would be Christian saints. Roman art declined more slowly than Roman letters. Technical ability lingered on and produced good architecture, sculpture, painting, and mosaic. The head of Nerva in the Vatican carries on the vivid realism of Flavian portraits, and the column of Trajan is an impressive relief despite much crudity. Hadrian labored to revive Hellenic classicism, but found no one to play Phidias to his Pericles. The inspiration that had stirred Greece after Marathon and Rome after Actium was missing in an age of self-limitation, contentment, and peace. The busts of Hadrian lose character by their smooth Hellenistic lines. The heads of Plotina and Sabina are pretty, but the portraits of Antinous repel us by their sleek, effeminate insipidity. Probably Hadrian's classical reaction was a mistake. It ended the forceful naturalism and individuation of Flavian and Trajanic sculpture, which had had indigenous roots in Italian tradition and character. Nothing reaches maturity except through the fulfillment of its own nature. Under the Antonines, Roman sculpture had its penultimate fling. Once at least it achieved perfection, in the figure of a young woman whose veiled head and modest robes are molded with a bewitching delicacy and firmness of line. Almost as good as the portrait of Marcus's Faustina, aristocratically refined and sensuous enough to accord with the innuendos of history. Aurelius himself was carved or cast in 1,000 forms, from the meditative and guileless yet eagerly sensitive youth of the Capitoline bust to the curly-headed professor in armor of that same collection. Every tourist knows the stately bronze of Aurelius Imperator on horseback, which, since Michelangelo restored it, has dominated the piazza of Rome's capital. Relief remained to the end a favorite Roman art. The Etruscan and Hellenistic custom of carving mythological or historical scenes upon sarcophagi returned in Hadrian's time as the hope of immortality took more personal and even physical form, and burial replaced cremation. 11 panels surviving from triumphal arches erected to commemorate the campaigns of Aurelius show the naturalistic style in perfection. No one is idealized, every participant is individualized. Marcus, receiving without pride the submission of a fallen enemy, is an appealingly human figure, and the defeated are shown not as barbarians, but as men worthy of their long struggle for freedom. In 174, the Senate and people of Rome raised that column of Aurelius which still adorns the Piazza Colonna. Inspired by Trajan's column, it pictured the Marcomannic Wars with a sympathetic art that honored conquerors and conquered alike. The spirit of the emperor had helped to form the art and morals of his time. The games were less cruel, the laws more considerate of the weak. Marriage was apparently more lasting and content. Immorality continued, openly in a minority, clandestinely in the majority, as at all times, but it had passed its peak with Nero and had ceased to be fashionable. Men as well as women were returning to the old religion or devoting themselves to new ones, and the philosophers approved. Rome was now teeming with them, invited, welcomed, or tolerated by Aurelius. They took full advantage of his generosity and his power, crowded his court, received appointments and emoluments, delivered countless lectures, and opened many schools. In their imperial pupil, they gave the world the culmination and disintegration of ancient philosophy. 5. The Emperor as Philosopher. 6 years before his death, Marcus Aurelius sat down in his tent to formulate his thoughts on human life and destiny. We cannot be sure that the ta eis heauton, to himself, was intended for the public eye. Probably so, for even saints are vain, and the greatest man of action has moments of weakness in which he aspires to write a book. Marcus was not an expert author. Most of the training that Fronto had given him in Latin was wasted now, since he wrote in Greek. Besides, these golden thoughts were penned in the intervals of travel, battles, revolts, and many tribulations. We must forgive them for being disconnected and formless, often repetitious, sometimes dull. The book is precious only for its contents, its tenderness and candor, its half-conscious revelations of a pagan Christian, ancient medieval soul. Like most thinkers of his time, Aurelius conceived philosophy not as a speculative description of infinity, but as a school of virtue and a way of life. He hardly bothers to make up his mind about God. Sometimes he talks like an agnostic, acknowledging that he does not know, but having made that admission, he accepts the traditional faith with a simple piety. Of what worth is it to me, he asks, to live in a universe without gods or providence? He speaks of deity now in the singular, now in the plural, with all the indifference of Genesis. He offers public prayer and sacrifice to the old divinities, but in his private thought he is a pantheist, deeply impressed with the order of the cosmos and the wisdom of God. He has a Hindu's sense of the interdependence of the world and man. He marvels at the growth of the child out of a little seed, the miraculous formation of organs, strength, mind, and aspiration out of a little food. He believes that if we could understand, we should find in the universe the same order and creative power as in man. All things are implicated with one another, and the bond is holy. There is a common reason in all intelligent beings. One God pervades all things, one substance, one law, one truth. Can a clear order subsist in thee, and disorder in the all? He admits the difficulty of reconciling evil, suffering, apparently unmerited misfortune, with a good providence, but we cannot judge the place of any element or event in the scheme of things unless we see the whole. And who shall pretend to such total perspective? It is therefore insolent and ridiculous for us to judge the world. Wisdom lies in recognizing our limitations, in seeking to be harmonious parts of the universal order, in trying to sense the mind behind the body of the world, and cooperating with it willingly. To one who has reached this view, everything that happens, happens justly. That is, as in the course of nature. Nothing that is according to nature can be evil. Everything natural is beautiful to him who understands. All things are determined by the universal reason, the inherent logic of the whole, and every part must welcome cheerfully its modest role and fate. Equanimity, the watchword of the dying Antoninus, is the voluntary acceptance of the things that are assigned to thee by the nature of the whole. Everything harmonizes with me that harmonizes with thee, O universe. Nothing for me is too early or too late which is in due time for thee. Everything is fruit to me that thy seasons bring, O nature. From thee are all things, in thee are all things, to thee all things return. Knowledge is of value only as a tool of the good life. What then can direct a man? Only one thing, philosophy. Not as logic or learning, but as a persistent training in moral excellence. Be thou erect, or be made erect. God has given every man a guiding daimon, or inner spirit, his reason. Virtue is the life of reason. These are the principles of the rational soul. It traverses the whole universe, and surveys its form, and extends itself into the infinity of time, and embraces the cyclical renewal of all things, and comprehends that those who come after us will see nothing new, nor have those before us seen anything more. But in a manner he who is 40 years old, if he has any understanding at all, has seen, by virtue of this uniformity, all things that have been or will be. Marcus thinks his premises compel him to Puritanism. Pleasure is neither good nor useful. He renounces the flesh and all its works, and talks at times like some Anthony in the Thebaid. Observe how ephemeral and worthless human beings are, and what was yesterday a little mucus, tomorrow will be a mummy or ashes. The whole space of man's life is but little, and yet with what troubles it is filled, and with what a wretched body it must be passed. Turn it inside out, and see what kind of thing it is. The mind must be a citadel, free from bodily desires, passions, anger, or hate. It must be so absorbed in its work as hardly to notice the adversities of fortune or the barbs of enmity. Every man is worth just so much as the things about which he busies himself. He reluctantly concedes that there are bad men in this world. The way to deal with them is to remember that they too are men, the helpless victims of their own faults by the determinism of circumstance. If any man has done thee wrong, the harm is his own. It is thy duty to forgive him. If the existence of evil men saddens you, think of the many fine persons you have met, and the many virtues that are mingled in imperfect characters. Good or bad, all men are brothers, kinsmen in one God. Even the ugliest barbarian is a citizen of the fatherland to which we all belong. As Aurelius, I have Rome for my country, as a man, the world. Does this seem an impracticable philosophy? On the contrary, nothing is so invincible as a good disposition, if it be sincere. A really good man is immune to misfortune, for whatever evil befalls him leaves him still his own soul. Will this evil that has happened prevent thee from being just, magnanimous, temperate, prudent, modest, free? Suppose that men curse thee, kill thee, cut thee in pieces. What can these things do to prevent thy mind from remaining pure, wise, sober, and just? If a man stand by a limpid pure spring and curse it, the spring never ceases to send up clean water. If he cast dirt into it or filth, it will speedily wash them out and be unpolluted again. On every occasion that brings thee trouble, remember to apply this principle, that this is not a misfortune, but that to bear it nobly is good fortune. Thou seest how few the things are to which, if a man lays hold of, he is able to live a life that flows on quietly, and is like the existence of the gods. Marcus's life, however, did not flow on quietly. He had to kill Germans while writing this fifth gospel, and in the end he faced death with no consolation in the son who would succeed him, and no hope of happiness beyond the grave. Soul and body alike returned to their original elements. For as the mutation and dissolution of bodies make room for other bodies doomed to die, so the souls that are removed into the air after life's existence are transmuted and diffused into the seminal intelligence of the universe, and make room for new souls. Thou hast existed as a part. Thou shalt disappear in that which produced thee. This too nature wills. Pass then through this little space of time conformably to nature, and end thy journeys in content, just as an olive falls when it is ripe, blessing the nature that produced it, and thanking the tree on which it grew. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.